connecting dynamic materiality and risk management. It's one of these subjects that it's easier said than done. A bit of context here. Actually, this year, a few months ago, to be precise, we launched a new application of our technology, Datamaran for executive. Essentially, we saw that ESG has now risen to the level of attention of the board members and the executive leadership. And essentially, companies are realizing that they need to step up their game in terms of the processes they have in place to monitor those emerging areas. And our new offering actually addresses the challenges posed by these new area. Now we have a community of the first early adopters of Datamaran for Executive. And Datamaran for Executive really focuses on this piece of connecting dynamic materiality risk management. But we know that while all guidelines and standards out there are recommending this connection, putting it in practice effectively is not easy. So by working with our early adopters, we actually developed a process to make it effective in practice. And what we're going to show you today is exactly that process. So what you can expect from this webinar is essentially a bit of theory at the beginning, and that's why we also have Meva that will help us understand the differences and the connection between materiality and risk management, but also a real example of how the two processes can be connected: dynamic materiality and risk management. We will use a hypothetical pharma company to actually show you the example, and of course at the end we will take your questions. So while I was looking for a way to visualize connecting dynamic materiality and risk management, I came across this comic here, and I think it does a great job, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, in actually representing how fast new issues are emerging at the horizon. Right now, we are all concerned with the impacts and effects of COVID-19, but at the same time, especially for people that are used to work in risk management, but also in ESG and sustainability, we know that there are bigger challenges that are coming up. And this comic shows that very effectively. And in a way, this is also, has profound implications in terms of how companies approach materiality on one side, but also risk management. And it's also redefining risk management in its own nature. Isn't that right, Meva? I'm afraid you're on mute.
And I'm on mute, of course. Absolutely. And I guess, as you said, before getting into the how and kind of the practical way of doing that, I also wanted to quickly look at, take a step back and look at how those two processes, so if you can go to the next slide, actually, look at how those two processes, so risk management on the left-hand side and materiality on the right-hand side, how they're linked. So what's interesting here is that when we build them down to first the objectives that they go to in terms of prioritizing what's important, what each of those processes help to determine, what they inform as well, and what they feed into, as well as how they're communicated externally, they are in the end very similar processes. The main differences between them are first the audience that they're for, but also the language that they're using. So in other words, we can see that, again, those are two similar processes that are not talking to each other. So if we go to the next slide, now with ESG issues that are now rising to the top of the C-suite agenda, those traditionally siloed processes really need to be embedded. So it becomes one process that takes into account both perspectives, the traditional one and the ESG and sustainability one that companies cannot afford to ignore or just to underplay. And this includes one, a risk assessment that includes those ESG risks, materiality results that will be both from a financial but also an ESG perspective, a corporate strategy that includes those ESG consideration, and then finally annual financial reports that also includes those ESG disclosures. So now that we've looked a bit at the theory, let's look at some of the steps that we recommend to enable this integration of materiality and risk management through ESG.
And before we go actually to our process, we want to hear from our audience actually. So we would like to launch our first poll. And as you can see, the poll asks you directly, have the insights from the materiality assessment ever been used to inform the risk assessment in your company? Yes, no, we're looking into it. We'd love to do it, but we don't know where to start. So you can see that the answers are coming in. It's a quite interesting distribution of answers. We will wait 10 more seconds. All right, I think we can close the poll and hear the results. So we can see a nice majority, over 1/3, that actually is connecting materiality assessment and risk assessment. So that's great. Although that the vast majority is looking into it, or they would love to do it, but they don't know where to start. There's 1/5 that still is not connecting the two. So it would be interesting actually to understand why the two processes are separated there. Excellent.
And I guess Donato, I think it's really reflective of the maturity also of companies and how sustainability has been taken into account so far, and the level of prioritization that it's been given also internally, and how those processes have been linked in the past. So it's interesting to see that.
Great. And with that being said, I think we can move to our proposed process. As you can see, it starts with conducting an annual materiality assessment, and then it connects that annual materiality assessment with identification of risk and opportunities, the integration of ESG factors in your risk inventory, engagement with the executive leadership and the board for validation, external disclosures on material issues in annual findings, and then having a dynamic process, which means monitoring what issues are emerging. To make you an example, we all know that right now climate change is a highly material issue, with companies racing to take net zero commitments and decarbonize their value chains. But what is going to be the next one? We have already seen the G7 mentioning in their documents natural related financial disclosures. We've seen initiatives like TCFD. So that's a concrete example that other issues are coming up. So let's start our journey with this hypothetical pharma company, and then let's look at the first step, which is conducting an annual materiality assessment. And this is where also we would like to hear from you, and we will launch our second poll.
Right, thank you, Donato. So indeed, so with our first step, we really want to understand what are the priorities for us to focus our efforts and our resources. So in the risk assessment process, there's a phase of risk identification aims really at understanding all these relevant issues before conducting an assessment to shortlist the most important ones. So the materiality assessment really allows us to list and rank all of these issues so they can be better integrated into the risk assessment process later on. So in order to, and again, sorry, it also allows us to identify weak signals of longer term risk so we can keep them on our radar, and those are more emerging issues. So both of those elements are at play here in terms of prioritizing what's the most important, but also what are the things that are kind of coming down the pipe. So as Donato was saying, we have Paul to launch as well before we continue with the demo on the platform. So should appear shortly.
And the poll has been launched, and it's, are you planning to conduct a materiality assessment in the coming months? Yes, no, and we don't know yet. Now, what's interesting here, and especially, talking with our clients, is that there is sometimes confusion about how often a materiality assessment should be conducted. Some companies, conduct it every year. Some others, have longer cycles, like 3 years or even 5 years. What we've seen in practice is that those companies that used to have longer cycles, like 3 years and 5 years, are now changing their approach, just because, as the nice comic was showing, there are always new issues that are emerging. So having, a regular materiality assessment process really helps identifying those issues as they emerge. And indeed, we can see that, almost 6% of our audience today is planning to conduct a materiality assessment in the coming months. So I think, the actual practical example that we'll have now on, how to conduct a materiality assessment using Datamaran can actually be quite relevant for you. So let's jump in the platform, and we'll see actually an example based on the healthcare and pharmaceutical analysis. As some of you may already know, Datamaran provides a data-driven materiality assessment, which doesn't mean that it's completely based on secondary data and doesn't take into account stakeholder engagement. Actually, our assessments are a combination of both processes. What you see here is a matrix visualization, which is the traditional way it is used to represent a materiality assessment, where on the vertical axis you have the perspective of the stakeholders, and Datamaran represents the different stakeholders groups by looking at what is the level of emphasis that companies, for example, your peers, your suppliers, your competitors, pose on the different issues within their annual filings, including sustainability reports and financial reports as well. Then what is the volume of mandatory regulations demanding or including requirements on each topic? What is the volume of voluntary recommendations, voluntary initiatives, voluntary policies that are addressing each issue, and the volume of news and online media? So that is used to represent the stakeholder perspective, whereas on the horizontal axis you have the company point of view. So what are the priorities according for the company? And in this view, of course, what you have on the top right corner are those most material issues where there is substantially alignment between the internal perspective and the external perspective. When it comes to the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, we see topics like products and services quality, customer privacy and data security, public health risks. Whereas if we go down, we can see actually responsible consumption and production, transition to renewable and alternative energies, which are less relevant within our hypothetical scenario. But what's more interesting than the visualization is actually the table of results. And as guidelines and guidance are moving away from the matrix visualization and focusing more on the kind of evidence and the kind of data that demonstrates which issues are material, this kind of data-driven analysis becomes essential to conduct a robust materiality assessment. So very simple. What you have here is, your collection of issues that should be assessed, and then their relative ranking of importance across the different data sets that Datamaran is analyzing. So in this case, I have the reports published by the companies operating in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, the mandatory regulation, the voluntary regulation, news, and then online media. A final external score is calculated as the weighted average across the different data sets, and that is plotted on the vertical axis, whereas on the horizontal axis, you have the company point of view that some companies represent through a management survey or through analysis of their own disclosures. There are multiple options to do it. What's interesting here is also to see the distribution of scores across the data sources, as in this way you can understand what is driving the materiality of each source. Once you identify what are the material issues, this analysis is not telling you anything about the risk and opportunities related to these issues. It's an analysis of their relevance. So the next step really in our process is understanding for your material issues, what are the potential risk and opportunities related to them. So back to Meva to explain the next step in the process.
Thank you, Donato. So indeed, so now that we have our short list of material issues, we want to understand first what are the risks and opportunities associated to those important issues, but also the extent to which those issues are currently addressed or not by your organization. So really what we want to do is, in the end, a gap analysis to identify the potential gaps between what's material and what are the risks that we're currently disclosing. So allowing us to really identify those potential blind spots. And a key component of that is to go more in depth each of those issues to understand what are the underlying factors that those material issues are made of. So while having a too granular approach earlier in the materiality assessment process, because it would not have been really practical from a prioritization standpoint, we now need a more detailed view to see what's actionable and really getting at that risk factor level. And so back to Donato to show us how this is done on Datamaran.
And again, this is quite a tricky passage, right? Because sometimes these considerations are included in a materiality assessment, but are not really visible. So with our newest application, the executive dashboard, we created an analysis that actually makes the identification of potential risk and opportunities automated and data-driven. So this is the overview provided by the executive dashboard for our pharma scenario. Again, here Datamaran is analyzing the entire universe of 400 ESG factors that we cover in our taxonomy. And of course, those are aggregated into higher level issues, so it's easier to navigate, which are the issues that you see here. Now, the first analysis that Datamaran conducts is an assessment of which issues are priorities among these. And you can see them organized between two areas: action required and monitor. Those issues that are in the action required area are issues that have higher volume of regulation addressing them, higher volume of news covering them, and higher volume of companies addressing them in their corporate reports. So essentially, the underlying logic is that the higher volume of regulation on a topic, the more likely is that there could be an event in relation to that topic. Then the second step of the analysis that Datamaran conducts is a gap analysis with the risk section of your disclosures. So as you can see here, there are 4 groups. Essentially, Datamaran will compare the external perspective of these issues versus what you are disclosing in the risk section of your filings, of your reports. So in the case of our hypothetical pharma company, we can see that climate change risk and management, for example, is a topic that may be addressed in the disclosures more broadly, but not, there are no disclosures that are identifying specifically risk factors in relation to that topic. So Datamaran indicates that as a new to assess risk, essentially because it's seeing a high prevalence externally, but no identification of potential risk factors in the disclosure. So Datamaran is a sort of adopting the perspective of third-party analysts or third-party observer that looks at the disclosure and essentially tells the client, to what extent the issue has been covered in the risk disclosures. And of course, those issues are quite high level. And when it comes to risk assessment, it is important to go more granular. So we can look at, for example, one of these partially covered issues like human rights. And we can see that Datamaran will break down that issue into the underlying topics and factors. So we have 3 levels: issues, topics, and factors that are way more granular. So we can see that in this case, children's rights is a topic within the human rights issue that is not covered in the public risk disclosure of our company. And we can also see what is the breakdown into the underlying factors: child protection, child labor, and so on. Whereas human rights more broadly is addressed, and we can see what are the underlying factors associated. In this way, it's easier to understand what issues are more likely to pose a risk, more in the shorter term, so that they are more urgent, and those that are more emerging, so it's more a longer term. And of course, those issues that are emerging, if addressed early enough, can be turned into opportunities. Now, getting back to our process, the next step is really make sure that these factors are reflected into your risk inventory. So back to Meva to explain why that is important.
Great, thank you, Donato. Just before I do that, just wanted to say that there's a few questions coming in on the chat and on the Q&A. We're just going to keep those for the end of the session, so don't hesitate to add your questions there, and we'll cover that at the end of the presentation. So yeah, going back to that step of updating the risk register. So basically, now that we have identified what are the risk factors related to our material issues, we also want to reflect that into our risk register or our risk inventory, where we track those risks that are relevant to our organization. And for that, Datamaran's external data provides that additional lens of risk assessment that captures those external signals in both a systematic but also a comprehensive way. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to give you a bit of an example of how it would look like with a mock-up risk register. It's a very a simple version of that. There's way more columns than that, but wanted to focus on that inherent risk part. So Datamaran data will really mainly provide information to determine that inherent risk score, which is the baseline assessment of the level of threat before taking into account any mitigation measures. So this assessment typically relies on at least 2 risk dimensions, usually likelihood and impact, but also can be completed with other dimensions like velocity, for instance. And the use of Datamaran's data is really twofold in that assessment. So first, it supports and completes the evidence gathered internally for risks that you have already identified. So like the first 3 ones that we see in that table, that allows us to identify any alignment or potential discrepancies, almost like a due diligence review, but also providing additional supporting evidence for those risks that were identified already. And secondly, it also provides a baseline for any newly identified risks. So based on those material issues that we've had as well from that first steps. And that also allows to review and validate those results by our team and experts internally. So really providing that preliminary assessment as to how important those risks are from a likelihood and impact standpoint based on those proxies that are available on the platform. And then finally, in order as well to determine the risk owner of those risks, we also want to understand what are the external pressures that are coming from the outside, and how those drivers in the end can be used as well to determine who should be the risk owner of those newly identified risks. So back to Donato to look at how this can be done on Datamaran.
Thank you, Meva. So all of this is really the core of the integration, right? Making sure that the ESG factors are reflected in the risk register. And in my experience, I've seen companies doing it. I've seen companies, for example, starting to have a single voice as an ESG risk in their ESG risk register. I would say that good starting point. But ideally, you want to break down the different ESG factors and reflect them within the register. Now, this, as this is evident from this mockup, requires a lot of data. The good news is that we designed the executive dashboard to give you exactly the data that you need to include the ESG risk factors within the risk register. So let's look at an example now. Again, looking at human rights as before, our executive dashboard provides a summary that defines the dimensions of likelihood, impact, and velocity, which, as you've seen, are essentially what you need to integrate those factors in the risk register. Now, Datamaran doesn't conduct a quantitative assessment of those issues, meaning that it's not calculating the probability of an event or monetizing the impact, but is a data-driven, informed assessment of the likelihood, impact, and velocity of these issues. And as Meva explained, the other key aspect that you need for the integration of these factors in your risk register is understanding what are the risk categories associated to each issue, so that you can define the risk owners. So Datamaran has an indication of what are the risk drivers prevalent for each issue, depending on what are the sources that are driving the importance of that issue. So for example, when it comes to human rights, we can see that 30%, 35% of that overall influence of that issue is actually related to a long-term regulation risk. And why is that? Because human rights is actually covered in voluntary policy initiatives, whereas the remaining 35%, it's actually coming from short-term regulation risk. So this is actually coming from mandatory regulation. And finally, 18% comes from the coverage of news, reputational risk, and 12% from the coverage that these risk as in your competitors' corporate reports, for example. So Datamaran will also give you, the ability to drill down and see what are the single data points. So the single, for example, initiatives that are covering the issue you are interested in. So if you need to explain why an issue is important and what are the main regulations or the main events that are driving it, you will have access to that level of information, which brings me to the next point, which is really, once you identified those issues, those factors that should go in your risk register, is about presenting it to your executive leadership. So back to Meva to explain why that is important.
Thank you, Donato. So yeah, so once our risk register has been updated based on that external data that we have, that internal assessment and feedback, the risk needs to be validated with our executive leadership team and our board. So this also gives them the opportunity to understand how those material issues relate to the strategy, or those will have been reviewed during that risk register update to understand, how does that relate to our business model, for instance. So it's also at this stage that it's important to define or validate with our board the risk appetite for each of those issues, depending on their contribution to or the impact on the strategy. And this is important because it will raise questions about the extent to which those risks impact our current business, our operation model, as well as identify potential opportunities that can be seized as well. So in order to support the risk definition, the strategic conversations, insights can be shared with regard to how peers are addressing and communicating about those issues, the level of regulations, both mandatory and voluntary, that relates to those issues as well, and therefore the level of pressure now or in the future that those risks represent. And finally, the extent to which those issues are also being covered in the news, to see again, what is the pressure that is coming from a reputational standpoint. So before going back to Donato, I think we have a last poll to launch with you today, and then we'll go into the platform.
Yes, and the poll is exactly about this point. Do you provide regular updates to your board and executive leadership on ESG-related risks and opportunities? So yes, directly to the board, or yes, via a committee or council reporting to the board, or no. So we see the answers coming in, and we appreciate that. The question is quite fluid, right? Companies are figuring out what is the best governance approach to address those emerging issues. And the difficult part here is that they often sit across different teams. So sometimes knowing who is the owner is actually quite challenging. Fantastic. So we have a quite clear dominant answer in our audience, as more than half of the respondents have a dedicated committee and council reporting directly to the board on these matters. And yes, many of the clients we work with are also this kind of structure, and we are seeing it emerging more and more, and to the point where it's some policies, some regulations are actually considering making it a requirement as well, where in some cases it already is. So let's go back to how this can be done in practice. One of the key challenges that our clients shared with us when it comes to sharing the information with the board is the ability to go from the high level, so the extremely succinct and concise summary, to the deep dive of the granularity of the data. So that is the principle we actually designed the executive dashboard. If you think about it, the application that you're seeing, it's a dashboard in itself. In other terms, we received feedback that even if we created some way to generate automatic reports or presentations, those would be too static for the kind of meetings that happen at that level. Instead, it's more useful to have a dynamic view where you can present what are the priorities, and then identify what are the emerging issues. So you can see here those identified with these icon are essentially the issues that over the past 3 months have had an increase in their importance. And then when there is a question on, when you have that board member that is so concerned about business models and business model resilience, you can deep dive live on the platform. So you can show, for example, how other peers are reporting on it. So we can see here a heat map that shows the business model resilience for the peers that have been selected and how they are reporting on it across the different documents that we have in the database. The high, medium, low is our score emphasis, and essentially measures to what extent a company is focused on that specific issue. And high emphasis is essentially, you can think about those issues that have large coverage in the reports, but are also mentioned in the CEO letter to the shareholders, for example, whereas low emphasis are those issues that are not covered more than a couple of times. And of course, once you presented the information internally, then the next step is presenting it externally. And that is actually happening through your annual disclosure. So back to Meva to explain the next step.
Thank you, Donato. So yeah, so now that we have our risk register updated, the material issues identified and validated, we can now also prepare for our annual disclosure. So including our ESG material issues within our risk register actually allows us to be consistent across our annual filings between what we identify as important in our sustainability or ESG information and which risk we identify as material from a financial standpoint as well. And this also promotes, in the end, more transparency and trust in how we address those material issues. So back to how the Datamaran can also support that process.
Yes, and we have just seen how actually Datamaran provides heat maps on the level of disclosure that your peers are adopting on the different topics. But on top of that, you can also understand what are the latest trends in the news. So you can also react in your disclosures to news events. So you can see here what is the overall coverage of the news on human rights and what is the breakdown between the different subtopics. So you can decide which one is actually more relevant. But also, you can see if your company is among the top 10 companies mentioned in the news, and what are the top stories associated to any peak. So that all of this helps you understand how to structure your disclosure. And in addition, Datamaran has also the reports in the database. So if you want to navigate within the different reports and the different disclosures, we can see here, for example, this is Novo Nordisk annual financial report. We are looking for all the references to climate change, risk and management. You can do that, and Datamaran automates that analysis. And the last step after you published your report is actually making sure that this process is dynamic, so you can capture emerging issues. So really the last step in our process is monitoring, and Meva explains why.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donato. So once our annual findings are complete, obviously, it's important for us to keep a pulse on our material issues, but also those emerging ones that we've identified even, from that first step around the materiality assessment to identify what are the weak signals and allowing us to be more proactive when those issues actually materialize. So really be able to pinpoint, those increases in activity and look at, how those topics, those issues can impact our organization. So again, back to Donato to look at how this can be done with Datamaran.
So the beauty of Datamaran is that our datasets are constantly updated. So we are actually able to track how the importance of the issues evolves over time, what is driving any change. In our executive dashboard, we have a new enhanced monitoring functionality. So once you create your overview, you will be able also to compare different points in time to understand how the likelihood of the different issues changed. So in my demo, I can see the change of over a period of around 5 months, and we can see what are the issues that have had the largest increase in their likelihood. So we can see, for example, top one, climate change, risk and management, If we want to zoom in and understand really what is driving that change, Datamaran provides you a summary, giving you, information on how the score of likelihood changed, but also what is driving that change. In this case, that we can see that over the past 5 months, there were 32 new corporate reports added to the database that are addressing climate change and risk management in their disclosures. And there are 25 new and 8 updated mandatory regulations on this topic. And of course, all these changes have some implications on the possible risk associated to the issue. Competitive risk in the case of new companies reporting on it, and short-term regulation risk in the case of new mandatory regulations. Right. So I can see that we are on time with our presentation. We probably have few minutes just to recap what we said, and what are the benefits of having this integrated approach, connecting materiality and risk assessment. One, you can understand your priorities in a data-driven way, but then at that point, the job is not done. You really need to understand what are the risk and opportunities of implications of the process. And in case, of existing risk management processes, you want to make sure that the external perspective is brought into that process. Many of our clients tell us, we want to bring the outside world in. And the final steps are really about sharing and engaging on your analysis, both internally, so with the executive leadership, but also externally through your disclosure. And then, of course, this has to be a dynamic, consistent, and systematic process. Anything you want to add, Meva?
No, nothing at this stage. I'm just looking at, there's a few questions on the Q&A. So if we can go through some of those before we end the session, I think that would be great.
Yes, that's that.
So I can pull that out if you want. So first one is, does Datamaran monitor our company's industry peers?
Short answer is yes. In the demo that we're looking at, it's just an hypothetical pharma company, so we were looking at the whole industry. But that's what our clients do. They create their own peer list and they select the companies they want to look at. And I would say that basically all of our clients look at their competitors for sure, but there are many that look, for example, their corporate clients or their corporate suppliers as well. So for Datamaran, it makes no difference if you analyze one company, 10 or 100. That's the benefit of a data-driven approach.
Great, thank you, Donato. Another question is, can Datamaran integrate other languages than English in its interface, but also in the data that it's analyzing?
Well, I guess for the interface, this is something that we'll bring to our product team, of course. Our experience is that we work with companies that have global operations, so that they tend anyway to have English as a working language. But I understand that if there are some clients that would like to have the interface in a different language. When it comes to local languages, we already have different languages in our in our regulatory data set. So we have global coverage. We're conducting experiments on other languages in the other data sets.
Great, thank you, Donato. So I'll take maybe 2 more. So how long into the future you are able to track emerging risks?
That's a great question, and it's a question on risk. Maybe you want to answer that one.
Me too. I mean, looking at the data that we're tracking, again, Datamaran unfortunately is not a crystal ball, but what we're trying to do is looking at what are the trends that we're seeing across all of those sources to understand what are the things that are gaining attention. So it's less about, kind of predicting the future, but also understanding what are the current trends around those different risks. So I hope that answers the question. And then maybe another one that was also linked to another one that we had on the chat earlier. So how many issues will be included in the materiality analysis? And there was another questions around, do you have specific issues for sectors and industries? So how many issues? It will depend on the industry, because we have a mapping for each of those based on those. So I think it's about between 30 and 36, depending on the industry. That are then composed of those different topics and then underlying factors, around 400 factors that we're tracking in total. So we have quite a few other questions on the chat, on the Q&A. I think we're running a bit over, so what we'll do is that we'll get back to you by email with those additional questions. But thank you all for participating and for engaging with us today. And yeah, anything else on your side, Donato?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for following us today, and thank you for all these questions. We'll make sure we respond to each of these via email, and look forward to having another session with you soon.
Great. Thank you, Donato. Thank you, everyone.